Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Published 1936. Nature of the Reformation. The breakup of united Western Christendom with the coming of the Reformation was by far the most important thing in history since the foundation of the Catholic Church 1500 years before. Men of foresight perceived at the time that if catastrophe were allowed to consummate itself, if the revolt were to be successful, and it was successful, our civilization would certainly be imperiled and possibly, in the long run, destroyed. That is indeed what happened. Europe, with all its culture, is now seriously imperiled and stands no small chance of being destroyed by its own internal disruption. And all this is ultimately the fruit of the great religious revolution which began 400 years ago. That being so, the Reformation being of this importance, it ought to form the chief object of historical study in modern times, and its nature should be clearly understood, even if only in outline. Now, to understand the Reformation, it is not enough to appreciate how it arose and what sort of men conducted the battle on either side when the struggle had broken out. It is equally important, and, perhaps, more important, to appreciate that the affair went, like all great conflicts in history, through certain phrases which perpetually recur in human disputes. All great conflicts begin with an uncertain phase during which one does not know which side will prevail, or whether either will prevail. After that phase comes a second phase which may be one of two things. It may be the increasingly apparent victory of one side over the other, or it may be stalemate, a drawn battle. Even if one of the two conflicting original opponents, either of those who are for a change or for those who are for tradition, secures a victory, the result is affected by the struggle. No victory, however complete on part of the conservatives, can make things return to exactly the same state as they were in before the challenge was thrown down. No victory, however complete on the part of the revolutionaries, can ever wholly get rid of the past, which will always remain intertwined with the fiber of men who have molded by it. But still, a complete victory on one side or the other does not usually produce an enduring state of things. When there is a stalemate, that is, a drawn battle, the result is otherwise. In that case there continues a further series of changes due to the survival and power of either combatant. The two camps remain in activity, the one opposed to the other, reacting one against the other, and there will be consequently a chain of developments which continuously produce new effects as the generations proceed. As an example of the first sort of thing, a complete victory, we have the success of our civilization against the Albigenses. That sect at one moment bid fair to break up Europe, but the orthodox armies, the orthodox monarchs and the leaders and the papacy won. The result was the secure state of affairs which made the Western world safe for Catholicism for centuries. An example of the opposite, of the drawn battle or stalemate, was the great Mohammedan effort beginning in the 7th century. It failed to overwhelm Christendom, but it had a sufficient success to establish a great new culture over against Europe and hostile to Europe, with the result that for centuries the two opponents remained intact and perpetually reacted one upon the other. In the case of the Reformation, it looks at one moment as though the side of authority and tradition was going to have a complete victory, in which case we would have today a settled and secure Europe, united again in the Catholic faith. Unfortunately, that victory was never won, and the upshot of the struggle, after 130 years, was the division of European civilization into two halves, the Protestant culture and the Catholic culture. As for the third, the eastern part, the culture attaching to the Greek Church, it did not much affect modern times between the outbreak of the Reformation and the rise of Russia 200 years ago. The universal, spiritual, and therefore social upheaval, generally called the Reformation, lasted from its inception to its conclusion as an open struggle about 200 years. You may take 1688, the exile of James II, or 1715, the failure of the Jacobite effort at the moment when there was still a living Catholic body in England, as the end of a conflict which clearly opens in the German Revolt of 1517. It ran through these stages. During the first 20 years or so, from 1517 onward, the revolt against the Church was closely intermixed with a very legitimate determination to reform abuses. It was not easy to see on which side a man or a book or an argument lay. There were grave corruptions in the Church and grave discontent with the organization of the Church on the part of masses of men who never dreamed of destroying Church unity or interfering with the great mass of Church doctrine and custom. This was especially the case in England, where the Church was less corrupt than elsewhere, and where the people were by nature conservative. But at the end of these 20 years there came, round about 1536 to 40, a change in what had hitherto been a confused moment. This change was primarily caused by the great effect of Calvin, who set out with the greatest lucidity and unparalleled energy to form a counter-church for the destruction of the old church. He it was who really made the new religion wholly hostile to the old one. At the same time, the temptation to loot church property and the habit of doing so appeared and was growing, and this rapidly created a vested interest in promoting the change in religion. Those who attacked Catholic doctrine, as, for instance, in the matters of the celibacy in the monastic orders, or of a divinely appointed hierarchy with the papacy as its summit, opened the door for the seizure of the enormous clerical endowments, monastic, episcopal, and parochial, by the princes and city corporations. Men already individually powerful through their wealth, especially through their ownership of land, joined in the rapine. The property of convents and monasteries passed wholesale to the looters over great areas of Christendom. Scandinavia, the British Isles, the northern Netherlands, much of the Germanies, and many of the Swiss cantons. The endowments of hospitals, colleges, schools, guilds, were largely, though not wholly, seized. Those of the clergy and hierarchy, the lands supporting bishoprics and chapters and parish clergy, were robbed of from 7/8 to half of their value. Such an economic change in so short a time our civilization had never seen. It had for effect the firm establishment of a permanent motive for confirming the success of the religious revolution. The new adventurers and the older gentry who had so suddenly enriched themselves saw, in the return of Catholicism, peril to their immense new fortunes. It is about this time, therefore, a generation after the first revolt, that there arises a distinct effort to impose in various places new laws and institutions to the destruction of Catholicism. After the middle of the 16th century, from 1550 to 60, that change is clearly apparent, and with it fighting begins. Fighting on the part of Catholic Europe to suppress the new Protestant governments, fighting on the part of these governments to suppress Catholicism in their own provinces, and in places civil war between the two parties. That fighting goes on during the second half of the century, roughly from 550 to 60 to, say, 1605 to 1610. There was fighting in Scotland, the beginning of what was to be an unending attempt to destroy Catholicism in Ireland by force. Fighting in the Netherlands. But the most critical and violent of all the fighting was in France. On the issue of the religious wars in France depended the preservation or destruction of Catholicism in Europe. Oddly enough, the German Empire, which was nominally ruled from Vienna, was spared and enjoyed peace compared with these other places. It was there that the Reformation had broken out, and yet successive emperors, by compromise, also from lack of power because so many of their subordinate princes and cities were practically independent, managed to keep the peace. But meanwhile the Catholic forces in Europe had tardily woken up, and there had been started what is generally called the Counter Reformation. But neither the Counter Reformation nor the active fighting which succeeded in preserving a part of Christendom intact would have been necessary but for the difficult success of the Protestant movement in England. This is the most important point to seize in all the story of the great religious revolution, and it is the point least often insisted on. The early enthusiasm for change was anarchic and dispersed. It had no form. It was of a violence which was bound to burn itself out, especially as it was resisted by all the organized central authorities of Christendom, the kings and the emperor. All that descended directly from the ancient foundation of our culture, the Romanized, civilized core of Europe, held out, save for one province, Britain. England was captured for the revolutionary side, not by any desire on the part of her people, but by a succession of incidents which marked each of them a step more difficult to retrace. First, on a matter in no way connected with the faith, the King of England, the most complete autocrat of his day, happened to quarrel with the Pope. The divorce of Henry VIII from his wife Catherine of Aragon, due to his infatuation with Anne Boleyn, began the business. It was conducted by a man of far greater ability than Henry, one Thomas Cromwell, an adventurer of high talent and no scruples, the great-uncle of Oliver and founder of the vast Cromwell fortune of which Oliver was a cadet. This Thomas Cromwell advised and carried out the confiscation of the monastic lands in England, a huge loot which was to be followed by further robbery of clerical endowments of every kind, including schools and colleges as well as the wealth of sees and parishes and chapters. The new fortunes arising from this flood of confiscation determined the issue. At the outset of the last quarrel with the papacy, some few Englishmen had stood out for the supremacy of the Pope and the consequent unity of Christendom. The most prominent of them, and the best venerated, is St. Thomas More. Henry, the king, had for ecclesiastical agent in his divorce one Thomas Cranmer, whom he made Archbishop of Canterbury, and who proclaimed the schism with Rome, an ardent opponent of the whole Catholic scheme at heart, and particularly of the Mass and Blessed Sacrament, though as long as Henry lived he dared not show his true feelings too openly, for Henry was, to the last, firm and even devout in his adherence to Catholic doctrine, and especially to the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the real presence in the Blessed Sacrament. A contrast to Cranmer, and a typical of the official England of this time, which led a people confused and bewildered by the new papal quarrel, was Stephen Gardiner, Henry's Bishop of Winchester. When it was too late, and after Henry was dead, he was appalled to see where Henry's personal quarrel with the Pope, which he had heartily supported, had led. He strongly affirmed his full Catholicism and attempted to save that of the country. At Henry's death, a rickety child, his diseased little son Edward, was nominally succeeded, but real power was, of course, in the hands of the unscrupulous men who formed the council. They rigorously pursued and increased the loot of religious endowments, and even made an effort to impose a new Protestant religion repugnant to the vast majority of Englishmen. The secretary to the government, who had all the evidence available, sets that majority at 11/12 of the people. Edward died, and, by Henry's will, his half-sister, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary Tudor, succeeded. Mary Tudor was received with wild popular rejoicing as the restorer of the old national religion of Englishmen and the legitimate queen, and the end, it was hoped, of the oppressive government by a clique of upstart rich men. To save the country from the Franco-Scottish domination, she married Philip, the heir to Spain. The marriage was not popular, and the English council, against the advice of Philip, and to show their independence of him, began a violent persecution of the still small Protestant minority. This persecution of the small but intense revolutionary group was especially violent in London, and, though not unpopular, yet did not receive any popular support. Neutral men, as always, attested in favor of the sufferers. Therefore, when Mary died, after a brief reign of half a dozen years, her half-sister, Elizabeth, succeeded her. Elizabeth was accepted with far greater ease, in that she had professed Catholicism loudly and had taken the oath to preserve it. But she would not have got the throne but for the support of her brother-in-law, Philip of Spain, who hoped to marry her as he had married Mary, and who regarded her as a counterweight to France, his chief rival. During Elizabeth's long reign she stood contrasted and opposed to Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, who stood for the old religion, and against whom, after a brief reign, her chief subjects rebelled. She took refuge in England, where she was kept imprisoned by the English government till they put her to death many years later. But the true author of the great change which comes with Elizabeth and gains strength with her as her long reign proceeds was a man of exceptional genius, William Cecil. He it was who, with Philip of Spain, put Elizabeth on the throne and ruled in her name. He saw that his new wealth was in danger so long as Catholicism remained strong in England, and proceeded to stamp it out. He it was who effected that gradual and profound change in English affairs by which the country was lost to the faith. The severance of England from Europe and from Christendom was, as I have said, the pivotal matter of the Protestant advance. On it the partial success of the religious revolution everywhere depended. Hence the necessity for beginning by an understanding of the English tragedy, failing which the disruption of Europe and all our modern chaos would never have appeared. It was coincidently with the beginning of the turn over in England, with the second half of the 16th century, that there began that effort against shipwreck which, I have said, is generally called the Counter Reformation. Vigorous popes undertook, unfortunately too late, the reform of abuses. The Franciscans took on a new missionary activity for the recovery of districts lost to the faith. A general council, which the popes before the Reformation had especially avoided because only a little while before general councils had proved so dangerous to unity, was summoned and is known to history as the Council of Trent. The most important single factor in the whole of this reaction was the militant and highly disciplined body proceeding from the genius of St. Ignatius Loyola. It came to be known by the name, which at first a nickname, but later generally adopted, of the Jesuits. These, by their discipline, singleness of aim, and heroism, were the spearhead of the counterattack. They were very nearly successful in England. They had very great effect in South Germany and later in Poland. All these forces combined made for a general restoration of Catholicism. There followed during the 17th century, from about 1600 to 1615 to 1690 to 1700, a ding-dong struggle between the now-rooted new religion in the areas where government had gone Protestant and the remaining Catholic bulk of Europe. The effort to recover England had failed. Scandinavia had been turned over just as England had, under the impulse of those who saw their opportunity for looting church lands, and their determination to keep this booty after the new wealth had been seized, and the northern part of the Netherlands, which since came to be known as Holland, still maintained itself with difficulty against its lawful sovereign, the King of Spain. But in Europe as a whole, the tide was setting for a restoration of Catholicism, which might have been universal. In England such a restoration was rendered more difficult by the character of James I's reign, 1603 to 1625. In France it was rendered more possible by the character of the contemporary French king, Henry IV, who was assassinated in 1610. It is with these two that the story of the drawn battle of the 17th century opens. It is Henry IV of France, yielding to the pressure of Paris, that saved Catholicism in that country. James I of England, guided and run by the second Cecil, William Cecil's son, Salisbury, was the man under whom, at the critical moment, England was prevented from becoming Catholic again. Next, the Emperor Ferdinand in Germany set out on a kind of crusade for establishing his own authority, which had dwindled so much in the past, and at the same time for spreading Catholicism again in the parts of Germany where it had been lost. Though Catholicism in France had been saved, yet the French had always lived in dread of the power of the Germans of the empire to the east of them. Therefore, when it looked as though the Emperor Ferdinand was going to become the very powerful monarch of a united Germany, France, although as Catholic as he, determined to support his Protestant rebels against him. The French minister who took up this policy and, therefore, is responsible before history for the failure of the Counter Revolution is the great Richelieu. He found ready to his hand a singular instrument. The sparsely populated Protestant districts of Scandinavia had produced a soldier of genius, the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus. Richelieu put the financial resources of France at work to hire Gustavus Adolphus as an instrument for weakening the empire and the Catholic reaction led by the Emperor Ferdinand. Gustavus Adolphus changed the art of war by his immense talent. During one dazzling year of triumph he was nearly established a Protestant German empire, more than 2 centuries before Bismarck. But at the height of his success he was killed in battle, 1632. His effect, however, had been sufficient to prevent the emperor from ever achieving a complete victory and from ever reuniting the Germans into one Catholic body. Meanwhile, the power of Spain was declining, and the Dutch, in what was later to be Holland, succeeded in getting their independence recognized by the King of Spain, their original sovereign. In England, the new Protestant character of the country was divided. You had one tendency expressed in Laud, the other expressed in the character of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell and his colleagues, representing the more intense Calvinist spirit, won a civil war which put an end to the old popular English monarchy, and during which the victors put Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to death. But the main significance of Cromwell is this, that in spite of the overwhelming superiority he enjoyed in equipment and trained men, he failed to destroy Catholic Ireland. He did his best. He not only massacred, but, what was far more effective, he seized the land of the Irish and ruined Catholicism economically, where it had been strongest in these islands. Yet he failed, and his failure was to prove of vast import to the fortunes of the faith, especially in the 19th century. By the middle of the 17th century, the struggle between Catholicism and now enthusiastic spirit which had challenged Catholicism had definitely accepted a drawn battle. The Treaties of Westphalia in 1648 established the principle that subjects should follow the religion of their government, and within the next 10 years all Europe settled down into 2 camps, the Catholic culture on one side and the Protestant culture on the other. The Catholic culture was, therefore, partially saved, but it had failed to recover Europe as a whole, and within the Church arose new movements which the Reformation had started. At the origin of one of these was the great name of Descartes, at the origin of the other the great name of Pascal. Descartes was a man of the first half of the 17th century. Pascal belonged to a generation immediately younger. Descartes was almost exactly the contemporary of Cromwell, but, of course, a far greater man with an infinitely greater effect upon civilization. Descartes introduced that idea which has dominated European thought since, and has had such powerful effects upon the Catholic Church itself, which may be called, in the best sense of the word, rationalism. The new expanse of physical science had begun with the 16th century and had been proceeding rapidly. It had been especially noticeable in the domain of astronomy, And astronomy is just that science in which we see the great law of nature working, as it were, inexorably and on the largest scale. Moreover, astronomy is dominated by mathematics. Descartes set himself out to examine the whole nature of things, that is, to make a complete philosophy. The Catholic Church is itself a complete philosophy on all that concerns the chief interests of man. But the Catholic Church does not set up to provide a philosophical system, still less a philosophical system which shall be necessarily true in its explanation of the material universe. Scholasticism, as it is called, or Thomism, from the final great work of St. Thomas Aquinas, might be called the official philosophy of the Church as it had stood throughout the late Middle Ages. But it was, and is, important to distinguish between this official acceptation of Thomism and the invariable teaching authority of the faith. For instance, in St. Thomas's philosophy and that of his predecessors, the real presence is expressed in the term transubstantiation, but no Catholic is bound to accept the scholastic doctrine of substance, and so long as the truth of the real presence is maintained, that is, that the whole of the humanity and divinity of our Lord is present in the Blessed Sacrament afterwards of consecration and in either element, and that the original bread and wine wholly cease to be, Catholic doctrine is satisfied. Now, Thomism had naturally declined with the decline of the Middle Ages. Scholastic disputation had degraded into what were often puerilities and debates nearly always tedious and half the time futile. It was indeed discussed with the dryness and lack of vitality of the school teaching, which had largely accounted for the revolt among the younger scholars. Descartes, a whole lifetime after the beginning of the Reformation, set out to begin, if he could, the whole thing over again, to ask and settle those questions which scholastic philosophy had also examined from the very roots. He even started with the discussion as to whether man himself, the mind originating the discussion, existed or no. He took as his starting point the undoubted truth that since a man thinks he is, and on that he would base his system, in the expanse of that system, he insists upon only accepting knowledge that is proved, and that is where he had so great an influence upon all the thought which followed for 300 years. For all the modern scientific habit until that of yesterday proceeded from Descartes. He himself had no doubts upon the faith, but his insistence upon the axiom that our acceptation of the truth must depend upon external proof of it, or upon deductive reasoning from observed constant natural laws, did make profound inroads upon ordinary belief. It was from this attitude of mind that all that is called the rationalistic attack upon the faith has ultimately grown. Pascal had nothing to do with all this. He was right on the other wing, which bases religion on emotion. Protestantism, and particularly Calvinism, although Calvinism also is a strictly logical system, is based upon emotion. A religious truth is known to be true not on external evidence, nor through deductive reasoning, but because you have experienced it. Hence the typically Calvinist business of conversion, the sense of being saved. Pascal, of course, did not accept such heresy, but he stood for a sort of compromise with it. Now, after the vivid object lesson of the Reformation in action, men could see the danger of breaking with unity. But many of the most intense minds within the Catholic culture, and especially in France and what is called today Belgium, though they had a horror of Calvinism, were attracted to this factor of religious experience, irritated by the constraints of an authoritative church and its practice, which they found mechanical. Further, the great effect of the Jesuits had been to recover Europe for the faith by making every sort of allowance, trying to understand and by sympathy to attract the worldly and the sensual and all the indifferent, and insisting the whole time on the absolute necessity of loyalty to the Church. Defend the unity of the Church, and talk of other things afterwards. Preserve the Church which was in peril of destruction. Only then, when you have leisure, after the battle, debate other things. This being the Jesuit attitude, and the Jesuits having become by far the chief influence in the mid-17th century throughout Catholic Europe, those men in Catholic Europe who leaned towards emotion in religion, towards personal experience, almost towards what the Calvinist enemy calls conversion, chose the Jesuits as their special antagonists. A powerful writer in the Netherlands called Janssen stood for all this. He wrote a book based upon St. Augustine, and that book represented the reaction of Calvinism upon the Catholic Church. Jansenism, as it was called, stood for all that swing, even in its extremes. And the great Pascal, a mathematician as Descartes had been, but also what Descartes was not, a genius at writing, took up the cudgels for Jansenism. He did not know his subject well. He had to be coached. Most of what he wrote in his famous pamphlets, the Provinciales, shows ignorance of his authorities, whom he only got at second hand. Also his Puritanism could not survive. But his style had that principal effect which good writing always has, and by that he still lives. From these two men, Pascal and Descartes, proceeded the two strains of influence which, between them, threatened to wreck the Catholic culture. Rationalism was its product, and first the deism and then the atheism of generations not yet born. Pascal and the Jansenists, whom he defended, acted as a support to the Huguenot revolt against the popular church in their own country. The support was not fully conscious and never took the form of active rebellion, even throughout the generations to come, and went to swell the attacks on the faith which, spread so widely in Catholic countries and especially France, so threatened at last, 200 years afterwards, during the 19th century, that till recently many thought the Church was doomed to decline and early extinction. Meanwhile, two other things were at work which would also in the future militate against that Catholic culture in Europe by which alone civilization could be saved. The first was nationalism, and the second, the growth in wealth and power of the anti-Catholic Protestant culture in the West. Nationalism began not in the worship of the nation, but in the worship of the prince. As in the case of Jansenism, the Catholic could not accept nationalism fully, but flirted with its ideas. Thus, in the case of the all-powerful king worship, which is rampant all throughout the Reformation period, the Catholic could not accept the full Protestant doctrine called the divine right of kings. But those inclined towards this error went as near to it as they could, and the great exponent of such a king idol, of local civil claims encroaching on the universal authority of the Church, was Louis XIV of France. He was a boy in the middle of the 17th century. He died several years after its close, and he was the greatest power in all the latter half of that long lifetime of his. From, say, 1660 to 1715, Louis XIV meant more to the Europe of his time than, say, the British governing class to the Europe of the latter 19th century. The King of France could never break with Catholic unity, of course. Indeed, in a sense, he was the champion of Catholicism, now that Spain, the old champion of Catholicism, was in decay, and that France herself had broken the power of the Catholic German Empire. But though he was thus the champion of Catholicism, he also went as far as he possibly could, short of breaking up with the Holy See, in insisting upon the right of princes to be independent within their own realms. As his realm was Gaul, or France, this spirit was called, on its religious side, Gallican Ism. Out of this insistence upon independence by the prince came the insistence upon the complete independence of nations, and that religion of patriotism which, in our own time, had grown to such exaggerated dimensions. Nationalism, the putting of the nation, which is ourselves, in the place of God, is, indeed, the great heresy of our day. Louis XIV, then, represented this force of separate independent national claims, disintegrating the national culture within. Meanwhile, the House of Orange, especially, represented the force militating against the Catholic culture from without. And of the House of Orange, William of Orange, who usurped the English throne and was contemptuously allowed by the English wealthy families to replace the last Catholic and active king of England, was an outstanding figure. He was the contemporary of Louis XIV. He stood in England, and indeed throughout Europe, although he was not built on the scale for such a position as the typical anti-Catholic political figure. He was in England only a puppet king, under the title of William III. Men laughed at him and disliked him, but he was the symbol of the growing anti-Catholic power of money, trade, and a new effort at expansion of commercial dominion overseas, of which the Dutch had been the originators and of which the English were to be their heirs. Prussia, the great anti-Catholic force that was to come, had not yet been born. With the typical figures here selected, I shall, to the best of my ability, fill my gallery, taking in their order first the English figures of that foundational affair, the loss of England. Then in their order arise King Henry VIII, his queen, Catherine, his paramour, Anne Boleyn, his minister-master, Thomas Cromwell, Sir Thomas More, who withstood him, Thomas Cranmer, the king's ecclesiastical agent, Gardiner, Clement VII, the Queens Mary and Elizabeth, Tudor Mary Stuart, and the great William Cecil, Lord Burghley. So far the English Reformation, on which all that was to follow turned. I next describe the later men of the 17th century, the drawn battle or stalemate. Henry IV of France, then James I of England, and then the Emperor Ferdinand, Gustavus Adolphus, and Richelieu. Then Laud, to illustrate the eternal difficulties of Protestantism, which unfortunately did not prove fatal to it. Then Oliver Cromwell. Then I shall consider Descartes and Pascal. Lastly, William of Orange and Louis XIV.